For 25 years, her name echoed through the halls of a dormitory, where safety shattered in silence. Sophie Sergei was 20, Yupik, building a future one appointment at a time. Then, April 26, 1993 arrived, and with it, a discovery that would haunt Alaska for decades. A custodian opened a bathroom door, a community lost its innocence, and somewhere, a killer walked free, confident that time would bury the truth. But some wounds refuse to heal, and some evidence never dies. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal tune in Bartlett Hall as the custodian pushed open the door to the seldom-used tub room on the second floor. Finals week was winding down at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and the dormitory carried the familiar sounds of students packing, calling home, and preparing for summer break. She expected to find nothing more than dust and forgotten towels. What she found instead would shatter every assumption about safety within these walls. Sophie Sergei lay lifeless, her body positioned in a way that suggested she had been ambushed in this intimate, vulnerable space. The custodian's scream pierced the afternoon quiet, sending shock waves through the hallway where students had been casually moving between rooms just hours earlier. The scene revealed a brutality that defied comprehension. Sophie had been stabbed repeatedly in the face. She had been shot in the back of the head at close range. She had been subjected to a violent attack of a personal nature. The positioning of her body told a story of someone who had been caught completely off guard in a place meant to be safe. By early evening, Alaska State Troopers had cordoned off the entire floor. Yellow tape stretched across hallways, where students had walked freely that morning. Fear thickened in the silence between whispered conversations and hurried phone calls home. Alaska State Troopers and University Police gathered around maps and floor plans in a hastily established command room. The initial examination confirmed what the custodian had witnessed: stabbing, shooting, and evidence of a personal attack that spoke to the perpetrator's rage and calculation. Biological material was collected for DNA analysis, though the technology of the early 1990s offered limited hope for immediate identification. No weapon was recovered from the scene. The tub room, investigators realized, had been chosen deliberately. It was rarely used, giving the attacker privacy to commit acts that would have been impossible in a more frequented area. Local radio stations broke the story as the sun set over Fairbanks. Parents from across Alaska began calling the university, demanding updates and reassurance that their children were safe. The calls came in waves: fear, anger, and disbelief crackling through phone lines that connected worried families to a campus that no longer felt secure. The investigation faced immediate obstacles. No eyewitness had seen or heard anything suspicious. Students were preparing to leave campus, scattering potential witnesses across the state and beyond. The window for gathering information was closing rapidly. By midnight, investigators began knocking on dorm doors, armed with clipboards and growing desperation. They needed to speak with everyone who had been in Bartlett Hall during the previous 24 hours, before these potential witnesses disappeared into Alaska's vast geography. Officers filed into the halls, prepared for a long night of interviews that might yield the one detail that could crack the case open. Detectives moved through the dormitory at 1 a.m, questioning sleepy students who rubbed their eyes and tried to remember details from what had seemed like an ordinary evening. The interviews painted a timeline that was both frustrating and illuminating. The last, confirmed, sighting of Sophie came from multiple witnesses who saw her step outside after midnight for a smoke. She had been staying temporarily with a friend in Bartlett Hall, visiting Fairbanks for a routine orthodontic appointment. Several students remembered seeing her return inside the building, but no one could pinpoint exactly when or where she went after that. The timeline approximation remained incomplete. Students reported hearing no screams, no sounds of struggle, no disturbance that would have indicated violence occurring just floors above their study sessions, and late-night conversations. Whisper networks began forming among the residents. Women especially felt the weight of vulnerability, realizing that someone had been attacked in a bathroom, a space they used daily, often alone, without a second thought about safety. The simple act of walking down the hall to brush teeth or shower now carried an undertone of fear. Cross-examination of witnesses revealed the challenge investigators faced. Some students had already left campus, driving home to villages and towns scattered across Alaska. Others were scheduled to fly out within hours. The window for comprehensive interviews was slamming shut. By morning, Detectives found themselves calling phone numbers across the state, trying to reach students who might hold crucial information but were now hundreds of miles away from the scene. Crime lab technicians worked through the early morning hours, analyzing the biological samples collected from Sophie's body. The DNA extraction process, while successful, highlighted the technological limitations that investigators faced in 1993. The unknown male genetic profile was clear and complete, but the databases available for comparison were primitive by later standards. The Alaska State Troopers' DNA database contained a small number of profiles from convicted offenders, and federal databases were similarly limited. Running the unknown profile through available systems returned no matches. The DNA sample was carefully preserved, sealed in evidence envelopes, and stored under controlled conditions. Technicians documented every step of the process, knowing that this biological evidence might someday become crucial if technology advanced enough to make identification possible. Newspapers across Alaska published headlines about the brazen attack that had occurred during finals week. The word brazen became associated with the crime, emphasizing how bold the perpetrator had been to commit such violence in an active dormitory during a time when students were awake and moving throughout the building. The investigation stalled rapidly as no suspect emerged from the interviews, background checks, or forensic analysis. Detectives had physical evidence, a clear timeline, and dozens of witness statements, but no name and no face to pursue. Weeks passed, and the case file grew thicker, while clarity remained elusive. Evidence envelopes were sealed and moved to storage, waiting for a future that might bring answers. Summer brought a different rhythm to the investigation, as detectives reviewed notes from dozens of interviews conducted in the weeks following Sophie's death. The comprehensive approach had generated substantial documentation, but failed to produce a viable suspect or clear motive. Campus residence lists were cross-checked against available databases. Background investigations were conducted on individuals who had access to the dormitory during the critical time frame. None of the people investigated matched the forensic profile extracted from biological evidence. The DNA analysis had confirmed that a male assailant was responsible for Sophie's death, but this scientific certainty only highlighted the gap between what investigators knew and what they could prove. The unknown genetic profile sat in evidence storage like a locked door without a key. Sophie's family mourned publicly, holding vigils in Pitkas Point that drew attention to her memory and the broader issue of violence against Indigenous women. Community leaders spoke about the pattern of missing and murdered Native women, placing Sophie's case within a larger context of systemic neglect and insufficient investigation. Limited FBI involvement due to jurisdictional constraints meant that the case remained primarily within the Alaska State Troopers' purview. Resources were stretched, and as other crimes demanded attention, Sophie's investigation gradually transitioned from active pursuit to periodic review. As fall arrived and students returned to campus, the case entered cold case territory. The case folder was placed on a shelf reserved for unsolved crimes, joining other files that represented families still waiting for answers. Annual reviews became the new rhythm of Sophie's case as detectives revisited leads with fresh eyes and updated investigative techniques. Each year brought hope that some overlooked detail might emerge, or that a witness might remember something previously forgotten. Re-interviews were conducted with former residents, some of whom had moved to other states or started families. The passage of time had not diminished the impact of Sophie's death on those who knew her, but it had blurred details that might have been crucial to identifying her attacker. The stored DNA sample remained unmatchable against available databases. Local, state, and federal systems were regularly checked, but the unknown male profile never aligned with any individual in the system. Multiple residents from the 1993 dormitory scene had become untraceable as people moved, changed names, or died. The pool of potential witnesses gradually shrank, taking with it any hope that someone might come forward with information that could break the case open. Indigenous leaders and activists pointed to Sophie's case as part of a broader pattern of violence against Native women that often received insufficient resources and attention. Her story became a reference point in discussions about systemic failures and the need for culturally informed investigative approaches. Agencies debated whether to reallocate resources to newer cases that might be more easily solved. Sophie's case required significant investment with no guarantee of resolution. By late 2017, new forensic methods were surfacing in the national consciousness. Investigators began hearing about genealogical breakthroughs, making headlines in other high-profile cold cases. Crime lab technicians retested older cases with updated tools throughout the early 2000s, hoping that advances in DNA analysis might yield new information from samples that had been collected years earlier. Sophie's DNA sample yielded the same unknown male profile when subjected to modern testing techniques. The genetic information was clearer and more detailed than the original analysis, but it still failed to match any individual in expanded databases that now included millions of profiles from across the country. The case had become one of Alaska's longest-running cold cases, a designation that carried both recognition and frustration. Sophie's name appeared in annual reports and cold case reviews, but these mentions felt more like memorial acknowledgments than active investigative pursuits. Sophie's story had become a reference point in activism for Indigenous victims, with advocates using her case to highlight the need for better resources and cultural competency in investigations involving Native women. Her memory lived on in policy discussions and training programs, even as her killer remained unidentified. Internal agency discussions occasionally turned to whether resources should be reallocated to newer cases with better prospects for resolution. The cost of maintaining cold cases competed with the demand to address current crimes, creating tension between hope and pragmatism. Technology continued advancing, and by late 2017, investigators were following national news stories about genealogical databases being used to solve decades-old cases. The Golden State Killer breakthrough had captured public attention and sparked conversations about new possibilities for cold case resolution. These developments offered a glimmer of hope that Sophie's case might finally find the breakthrough it had been waiting for. The Alaska State Troopers Cold Case Unit convened in 2018 to discuss applying genetic genealogy techniques to their most challenging unsolved cases. The success of genealogical analysis in solving the Golden State Killer case had demonstrated the potential for this approach to breathe new life into investigations that had stalled for decades. Sophie's case was selected as a priority for this new investigative approach. The unknown male DNA that had been preserved since 1993 was submitted for genealogical analysis, marking the first time in 25 years that the case had access to a genuinely new investigative tool. The genealogical analysis process involved comparing the unknown DNA profile against databases containing genetic information from individuals who had voluntarily submitted samples for ancestry research. The goal was to identify relatives who shared genetic markers with the unknown suspect. The analysis returned a match that tied the unknown suspect to a woman identified as his aunt. This breakthrough represented the first concrete lead in Sophie's case since the original investigation, providing investigators with a family tree that could be traced to identify potential suspects. The family tree analysis pointed toward Stephen H. Downs, a name that had never appeared in the original investigation files. Background research revealed that Downs had been an 18-year-old freshman living in Bartlett Hall during the spring of 1993. National excitement grew around genealogy solving historic crimes, with media outlets regularly reporting on cold cases being cracked through this innovative approach. The folder that had sat dormant for years was marked active for the first time in decades. Investigators traveled to Auburn, Maine, in February 2019, carrying a DNA warrant and 25 years of accumulated questions. Stephen H. Downs answered his door calmly, displaying no obvious signs of recognition or concern when officers identified themselves. The execution of the DNA warrant proceeded without incident. A cheek swab was collected from Downs, who had built a life in Maine working as a nurse. His profession and community integration painted a picture of respectability that seemed to conflict with the brutal crime he was suspected of committing. Maine locals expressed shock as news trucks began surrounding Downs's street. Neighbors described him as quiet, reliable, and unremarkable, someone who had lived among them without raising any suspicions or concerns. The defense immediately raised concerns about chain of custody procedures and the legality of using genealogical databases to identify suspects. These challenges would become central themes in the legal proceedings that followed. Laboratory analysis of the DNA sample collected from Downs was expedited, given the significance of the case and the length of time Sophie's family had been waiting for answers. The results were scheduled to arrive within days. The possibility of finally having a name attached to Sophie's killer energized the investigative team. After years of following leads that went nowhere and re-interviewing witnesses who had nothing new to offer, the prospect of concrete forensic evidence linking a suspect to the crime felt almost surreal. Days later, the conclusive results arrived at Alaska headquarters, confirming what genealogical analysis had suggested. The laboratory results were received with a mixture of excitement and solemn responsibility as investigators gathered in the conference room to review the findings. The DNA match was confirmed with statistical certainty that left no room for doubt. The genetic profile, extracted from Stephen H. Downes's cheek swab, aligned perfectly with the biological sample collected from Sophie's body in 1993. The match was so precise that expert testimony would later describe it as statistically impossible for the samples to have come from different individuals. Further background investigation revealed details that had not been apparent during the original case. Downes had lived on the same floor as Sophie's friend in Bartlett Hall, placing him in the exact location where the crime occurred during the critical time frame. Indigenous voices expressed cautious optimism as news of the DNA match spread through Alaska's native communities. Sophie's case had become symbolic of broader failures to solve crimes against Indigenous women, making this breakthrough particularly significant for advocates and family members. Legal complications arose immediately, as defense attorneys began preparing challenges to the admissibility of genealogical evidence. The extradition process required careful coordination between Maine and Alaska authorities. The investigation that had been marked by frustration and dead ends for 25 years suddenly accelerated into a flurry of legal preparation, media attention, and emotional anticipation from everyone who had been touched by Sophie's story. Soon after the DNA confirmation, Downes was arrested in Maine and began the legal process of extradition to Alaska, where he would face charges related to Sophie's death. Pre-trial motions filled an Alaska courtroom as lawyers presented arguments that would shape how genealogical evidence could be used in future cases. The legal precedent being established extended far beyond Sophie's individual case. The court ruled that genealogical evidence was admissible, rejecting defense challenges that claimed the investigation had violated privacy rights and constitutional protections. This ruling represented a victory for prosecutors and a validation of the investigative techniques that had identified Downes. Defense attorneys challenged genealogical methods on multiple fronts, arguing that the databases used for analysis contained information from individuals who had not consented to law enforcement use. They also questioned the reliability of genetic genealogy compared to traditional forensic techniques. More than 150 exhibits were listed for the upcoming trial, reflecting the comprehensive nature of the evidence collection and the complexity of presenting a case that spanned nearly 3 decades. Media coverage intensified as legal experts debated the ethics of genealogical databases and their use in criminal investigations. The case attracted attention from privacy advocates, law enforcement professionals, and genealogy enthusiasts who understood the implications of the court's decisions. Defense attorneys pushed for suppression of the genealogical evidence, arguing that allowing this type of investigation would set a dangerous precedent for privacy rights. Their motions were denied, but the arguments would continue throughout the trial. Jury selection was scheduled to begin in early 2022, bringing Sophie's case closer to resolution than it had been at any point since 1993. The jury was sworn in as the courtroom filled with family members, advocates, and media representatives who had followed the case for years. The prosecution's opening statement outlined the DNA match, the historical timeline, and Downes's proximity to the crime scene during his time as a dormitory resident. Biological sample expert testimony was presented to establish the chain of custody and the reliability of DNA evidence that had been stored for nearly 30 years. Prosecutors emphasized the statistical impossibility of the genetic match being coincidental. The timeline was reconstructed using statements from dormitory residents who had been interviewed in 1993. These witnesses, now decades older, provided testimony about their memories of that night and the days that followed. Reporters live tweeted major moments from the courtroom, providing real-time updates to a public that had been following the case through media coverage and social media discussions. The defense insisted that DNA evidence could have been transferred or contaminated, despite the careful storage procedures and chain of custody documentation that had been maintained throughout the investigation. The prosecution's case relied heavily on forensic evidence rather than eyewitness testimony, given that no one had actually seen Downes commit the crime. The DNA match became the centerpiece of their argument for conviction. Tension was high as the court adjourned after the first day of testimony. The trial represented the culmination of 29 years of investigation, legal preparation, and emotional anticipation from everyone connected to Sophie's story. Defense opening statements filled the courtroom with silence as attorneys presented their counter-theory to the prosecution's case. Privacy violations in genealogy searches became a central theme, with defense lawyers arguing that the investigation had overstepped constitutional boundaries. Chain of custody records were examined in detail as the defense attempted to identify any break in the procedural handling of evidence between 1993 and 2019. Every transfer, storage condition, and laboratory procedure was scrutinized for potential contamination or mishandling. The critical midpoint turn occurred when the DNA match withstood aggressive cross-examination despite defense warnings about the unreliability of genetic genealogy. Jurors visibly reacted as the defense's strongest angle appeared to collapse under the weight of scientific evidence. Victim advocates called the DNA match historic, emphasizing its significance not only for Sophie's case, but for the broader landscape of cold case investigations. The successful use of genealogical analysis was being watched by law enforcement agencies across the country. The defense pivoted to alternate suspect theories, attempting to raise reasonable doubt by suggesting that other individuals could have committed the crime. However, these arguments lacked forensic basis and relied on speculation rather than evidence. Media coverage highlighted the tensions between scientific advancement and privacy concerns, with legal experts offering commentary on the implications of the court's decisions. The prosecution regained momentum as forensic evidence continued to support their case, setting the stage for witness testimony that would further establish Downes's presence and opportunity. Witnesses described the dormitory layout and movement patterns during the second week of trial, establishing the physical environment in which the crime occurred. Former residents, now adults with families and careers, returned to relive memories they had tried to forget. Dormitory records confirmed Downes's residency on the key floor of Bartlett Hall during the spring semester of 1993. Housing assignments and room registrations provided documentary evidence of his presence in the building during the time frame when Sophie was killed. No eyewitness could physically link Downes to the crime, making the DNA evidence the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. This absence of direct observation highlighted both the perpetrator's stealth and the reliance on forensic science for conviction. The public remained divided as some expressed doubt about the reliability of genetic genealogy, while others embraced the technology as a breakthrough for cold case resolution. Online discussions reflected broader societal tensions about privacy, justice, and scientific advancement. Cross-examination highlighted the absence of a clear motive linking Downes to Sophie. The defense emphasized that the prosecution could not explain why an 8-year-old freshman would attack someone he had no known relationship with. Jurors scribbled notes and leaned forward during testimony, displaying visible engagement with the complex forensic evidence being presented. Their body language suggested the weight they placed on scientific testimony versus circumstantial evidence. Forensic analysts were scheduled to testify next, promising to provide detailed explanations of DNA analysis, statistical probability, and laboratory procedures. Forensic experts took the stand to explain the DNA analysis that had linked Downes to Sophie's death. Their testimony focused on the statistical probability of the genetic match and the reliability of modern laboratory techniques. The DNA was confirmed to be uniquely tied to Downes, with probability calculations that defense attorneys struggled to challenge effectively. Expert analysis of the biological material was presented in language designed to be accessible to jurors without scientific backgrounds. No contamination was found during the extensive laboratory review of evidence, storage, and handling procedures. The proper storage conditions maintained for nearly 3 decades had preserved the genetic material in a condition suitable for accurate analysis. Headlines across Alaska read, "Decades-old evidence speaks," capturing the public's fascination with the intersection of time, technology, and justice. The case had become a symbol of persistence and scientific advancement. The defense attempted to discredit expert credentials and laboratory procedures, but failed to identify any significant flaws in the forensic analysis. Cross-examination revealed the thoroughness of the scientific process and the multiple levels of verification involved. Jurors' faces showed emotional strain as they processed the technical details of DNA analysis alongside the human reality of Sophie's death. The courtroom atmosphere reflected the weight of making a decision based on evidence that had waited decades to be understood. Closing arguments were scheduled for the following week, bringing the trial closer to the moment when 29 years of investigation would culminate in a jury's decision. Closing arguments began with prosecutors emphasizing the DNA evidence, timeline reconstruction, and physical evidence that connected Downs to Sophie's death. The presentation was methodical and fact-driven, avoiding emotional appeals in favor of scientific certainty. Defense attorneys insisted on uncertainty and privacy concerns, arguing that genetic genealogy represented an overreach of investigative authority that violated constitutional protections. They emphasized reasonable doubt as the standard jurors should apply. Over 150 exhibits were summarized for the jury, including photographs, laboratory reports, witness statements, and dormitory records. None of the evidence pointed to anyone other than Downs as Sophie's attacker. The community waited anxiously for a verdict as the trial reached its conclusion. Indigenous advocates, family members, and media representatives gathered outside the courthouse, reflecting the broad interest in the case's outcome. Defense arguments for reasonable doubt focused on the absence of motive and the reliance on genealogical evidence that they characterized as experimental and potentially unreliable. Jury instructions covered legal standards for evaluating DNA evidence, circumstantial evidence, and reasonable doubt. The judge's guidance would shape how jurors approached their deliberations. The prosecution's final statement returned to the statistical impossibility of the DNA match being coincidental, urging jurors to trust the science that had waited nearly 30 years to speak for Sophie. The courtroom emptied slowly after closing arguments, heavy with tension and anticipation. 29 years of investigation had led to this moment when 12 jurors would determine whether Stephen H. Downs was responsible for Sophie Sergey's death. Jurors entered the deliberation room carrying binders stacked with evidence, testimony transcripts, and exhibits that represented the most comprehensive presentation of Sophie's case ever assembled in a courtroom. The review process began with timeline reconstruction, DNA analysis tables, and consistency checks of witness testimony spanning nearly 3 decades. Jurors methodically worked through each piece of evidence, seeking clarity on complex forensic concepts. The genetic genealogy chain was validated through careful examination of laboratory reports and expert testimony. Jurors questioned statistical probabilities, contamination risks, and alternative explanations for the DNA match. No alternate DNA was found on Sophie's body, strengthening the prosecution's argument that Downs was the sole perpetrator of the crime. This absence of additional genetic evidence simplified the forensic picture for jurors. The Fairbanks community halted normal activities as residents waited for news from the courthouse. Local businesses reported unusual quiet as people stayed close to news sources, anticipating the verdict. Disagreement among jurors focused on the weight of DNA evidence versus the absence of clear motive. Some questioned whether genetic genealogy alone was sufficient for conviction beyond reasonable doubt. Media representatives maintained their vigil outside the courthouse, providing live updates to news organizations across Alaska and beyond. The national attention reflected the case's significance as a test of genealogical investigative techniques. On day 2 of deliberations, debate intensified as jurors wrestled with the implications of their decision for both Downs and Sophie's memory. The final day of deliberations brought focused review and discussion as jurors worked toward a unanimous decision. The DNA evidence had become the central factor in their evaluation of guilt or innocence. After 3 days of careful consideration, the jury reached a unanimous decision that would finally answer the question that had haunted Alaska for nearly 30 years. The verdict form was completed with signatures that represented the collective judgment of 12 individuals who had carefully weighed evidence, expert testimony, and legal standards. The DNA match had become the decisive factor for jurors who concluded that the statistical probability of innocence was too remote to constitute reasonable doubt. People gathered outside the courthouse as word spread that a verdict had been reached. The crowd included family members, advocates, media representatives, and curious residents who had followed the case for years. Personal doubts that had lingered among some jurors were resolved through group discussion and careful review of the evidence. The deliberation process had been thorough and respectful of the gravity of their decision. The verdict would be read in open court, bringing Sophie's case to a conclusion that had been anticipated since DNA was first collected at the crime scene in 1993. The bailiff prepared the courtroom for the formal reading of the verdict, knowing that this moment would close one chapter of Sophie's story while beginning another focused on justice and accountability. The courtroom filled to capacity as Judge Thomas Temple presided over the reading of the verdict that would determine Stephen H. Downs' fate. Family members, advocates, and media representatives held their breath in anticipation. The jury foreperson stood to deliver the decision that had taken 3 days to reach. Stephen H. Downs was found guilty of first-degree murder and first-degree sexual assault in connection with Sophie Sergey's death. Despite aggressive defense objections and challenges to genealogical evidence, the science had withstood legal scrutiny and convinced 12 jurors of Downs's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The courtroom response was a mixture of tears, relief, and shocked silence as the reality of the verdict settled over everyone present. Sophie's family members quietly embraced. Their 29-year wait for answers finally concluded. Defense attorneys immediately signaled their intent to appeal the conviction, arguing that the verdict was based on evidence that should not have been admissible in court. The conviction represented Alaska's first successful prosecution, based primarily on genetic genealogy, establishing legal precedent for future cold case investigations. Media coverage emphasized the historic nature of the verdict and its implications for other unsolved cases that might benefit from similar investigative techniques. Downs showed little emotion as the verdict was read, maintaining the calm demeanor that had characterized his appearance throughout the trial. Sentencing was scheduled for later in the year, giving both prosecution and defense time to prepare arguments about the appropriate punishment for crimes that had occurred nearly 3 decades earlier. Judge Thomas Temple entered the courtroom for sentencing with the solemn responsibility of imposing punishment for crimes that had waited 29 years for resolution. The courtroom atmosphere reflected the gravity of this final legal proceeding. A composite term of 75 years was imposed, reflecting the severity of the crimes and their impact on Sophie, her family, and the community. The sentence included 67 years for murder and 8 years for sexual assault, to be served consecutively. Downs would be eligible for discretionary parole after serving 25 years, a possibility that would not arrive until he was well into his 70s. The sentence effectively ensured that he would spend the remainder of his productive adult life in prison. Advocates called the sentencing long overdue justice for Sophie and recognition of the broader pattern of violence against Indigenous women that her case represented. The defense argued that the sentence was excessive for someone who had no prior criminal record and had lived a productive life for decades after the crime. Their arguments were rejected by Judge Temple. Sophie's family expressed gratitude for the conviction and sentence, while acknowledging that no punishment could restore what had been lost or heal the wounds inflicted by nearly 3 decades of uncertainty. Official confirmation was provided that Downs would be required to register as a sex offender for life, adding another layer of accountability and public safety protection. Defense attorneys immediately began preparing appeal documents that would challenge both the conviction and the sentence. Outside the courthouse, media interviews captured the reactions of family members, advocates, and community leaders who had followed Sophie's case through its long journey from cold case to conviction. Officials confirmed the lifelong sex offender registration requirement that would follow Downs for any period of freedom he might eventually experience. Sophie's case was officially recognized as the first genealogical trial conviction in Alaska, establishing legal precedent for the use of similar techniques in other cold cases. National debate intensified about the balance between privacy rights and public safety in the use of genealogical databases for law enforcement purposes. Critics continued to argue that genealogical investigations represented government overreach and violated the privacy expectations of individuals who had submitted DNA for ancestry research. Legal scholars weighed in on the ethics of genealogy-based investigations, with opinions ranging from enthusiastic support to serious constitutional concerns. Snow began falling softly as people dispersed from the courthouse, carrying with them the knowledge that Sophie's case had finally reached the planned resolution that had seemed impossible for so many years. The conviction and sentencing represented closure for some, and the beginning of new legal challenges for others. Defense preparations for appeal continued as they sought to overturn the verdict through higher courts. Media attention gradually shifted to other stories, but Sophie's case remained a reference point for discussions about cold case investigations, Indigenous victims' rights, and the role of advancing technology in criminal justice. The Alaska Court of Appeals convened to review briefs, challenging both the conviction and the investigative methods used to identify Downs as a suspect. Defense attorneys focused their arguments on constitutional privacy violations. The appeals panel reviewed constitutional challenges to genealogical DNA analysis, examining whether the investigative technique violated Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches. No procedural violations were found by the panel in their review of the investigation, trial proceedings, and evidence presentation. The conviction appeared to be legally sound, despite the novel investigative techniques involved. Sophie's case had become legally intact, withstanding the initial round of appellate challenges that defense attorneys had prepared. Legal scholars continued to debate the ethics of genealogy-based investigations, with academic conferences and law review articles examining the implications of the court's decisions. The defense argued that genealogy represented a privacy breach that exceeded reasonable investigative authority, but the court remained unmoved by these constitutional arguments. Judges reviewed extensive briefs, hearing transcripts, and legal precedents related to DNA evidence admissibility and investigative procedures. The appeals process would continue for months, or potentially years, as defense attorneys pursued every available legal avenue to overturn the conviction. Downs remained incarcerated as the appeal was reviewed, serving his sentence, while legal challenges proceeded through the court system. The conviction's survival of initial appeals strengthened its precedential value for other cases involving similar investigative techniques and evidence types. State forensic experts reflected on the breakthrough that had solved one of Alaska's most challenging cold cases, crediting genetic genealogy with providing the key that had unlocked nearly 3 decades of mystery. Genealogy was credited with solving the case after traditional investigative methods had been exhausted, demonstrating the potential for technological advancement to breathe new life into seemingly hopeless investigations. The complete timeline from 1993 to the final DNA match was re-examined as a case study in persistence, scientific advancement, and the importance of preserving evidence for future analysis. Sophie's case had become a model for cold case units across the country, with law enforcement agencies studying the investigative approach and legal strategies that had led to successful conviction. Renewed funding for cold case investigations followed public attention to genealogical breakthroughs, with legislative bodies allocating resources to apply similar techniques to other unsolved crimes. Training programs for investigators began incorporating genetic genealogy techniques, acknowledging this tool as a standard component of modern cold case investigation. Ongoing ethical debates persisted about privacy versus justice, with no clear resolution to the tensions between individual rights and public safety that genealogical investigations represented. The community continued honoring Sophie through annual remembrance events, scholarship programs, and advocacy efforts focused on violence against Indigenous women. Academic institutions began studying Sophie's case as an example of how technology, legal precedent, and community advocacy could combine to achieve justice after decades of uncertainty. In the quiet village of Pitkas Point, evening settled over the Yukon River as the community reflected on the long journey from Sophie's death to her killer's conviction. The years of uncertainty had finally given way to accountability. Sophie's case had influenced reforms and awareness campaigns focused on missing and murdered Indigenous women, with her story becoming a symbol of both tragedy and resilience. Her memory had become a catalyst for change, inspiring legislative initiatives, improved investigative protocols, and cultural competency training for law enforcement agencies working with Native communities. Advocates emphasized the continued need for culturally informed victim services and investigations that honored the values and traditions of Indigenous communities affected by violence. The legal victory represented justice achieved, but it could not restore the years lost or heal the wounds inflicted by Sophie's death and the decades of uncertainty that followed. Educational programs at the University of Alaska Fairbanks now included Sophie's story as part of discussions about campus safety, criminal justice, and the intersection of technology with traditional investigative methods. Her case had become a testament to the power of persistence, scientific advancement, and community advocacy in pursuing justice, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. The river flowed steady beneath the northern sky, carrying with it the memory of a young woman whose life had been cut short but whose legacy continued to influence positive change. Resilience remained in motion, just like the eternal flow of the water that connected Sophie's village to the wider world, where her story had made a lasting difference.